Right, welcome back. So now we're going to talk about, we're going to continue with the four dimension talk, and we're going to actually look at some kind of examples of using now the first dimension and going through each of the four dimensions and what the first dimension represents. So now, when we're talking about the first dimension, and let's look at the first dimension of the first dimension. First dimension of the first dimension. So when we talk about the first dimension, it's about information, it's about integration. So if you integrate all the information that you know about astrology and about all the planets, the signs, the houses, the nakshatras, if you have all of that information integrated into your consciousness, then when you look at a chart, you can just instinctively know what it is that you're seeing when you look at it. You don't have to think, you don't have to look down at a book, you don't have to resort to YouTube videos, but except if they're mine, then it's okay. So you'll just look at it and you'll just know. You'd be like, okay, I can see. Oh, look, that's Mars and Aries. What does that mean? Oh, well, I know this, and this about Mars. I know this, and this about Aries. I know this, and this. So you easily put things together, but you're not even thinking about it. You just see it and you appreciate it. It comes into your consciousness because it's already ingrained. Maybe even more so, not into your consciousness, but into your subconsciousness even. So that it's not an effort that you have to take to be able to pull the information out of the chart. You don't have to think. You don't have to use like, oh wait, what does it mean to have this and this and this together? Wait, what is Mars about again? Let me read. If you don't know that stuff, you don't know what's the sixth house? What does the sixth house indicate? Yeah. And the thing about the first dimension too is that, well, it's going to take a certain amount of time. There's going to be times where it's always healthy to study it, because I don't think there's, not that I don't think, I know for a fact you will never know exactly every single little thing that all planets represent, that all planets are a karaka for, that all planets are, or that all signs represent, that all houses represent, because there's just such a diversity of things in this world that you're never going to know every single one of those. So with that being said, it's good to always study the first dimension, always try and learn more. If you hear someone saying about, oh wow, I never really thought about Mars ruling butcher knives before, but yeah, I could see how that makes a lot of sense. And then, so always look more, and then when you know about the characteristics and stuff, like especially when we're talking about the planets really, they're the action, they're the active things, the active consciousness in the chart. Those are the most important things to have knowledge about. I mean, it's important to know what everything is, but it's those guys that the planets mean everything. So with that being said, now, when we're talking about the first dimension, like I said, we talk about information and integration. So, when we talk about information, there's really two ways that you can do this. One of the two things kind of to talk about here. So, we're going to talk about the specific things in a second, but what I also want to say is that we're talking about information. So, information means that we need to know like a glossary of terms when it comes to it. We need to know what it means if someone says about, oh yeah, I use a South Indian chart, the North Indian chart. So you want to know about what kind of, which particular brand of chart that you're looking at, because there's a few, or there's a lot. Maybe there's probably more than I'm even aware of. And so then you want to know about, some Sanskrit terms that you're going to hear, like Rashis and Graha and these types of things, because I'm going to use these terms. What's a Varga? You're going to want to know. You're going to want to be familiar with that. And then you'll hear about one of the glossary words I have written down right here, which is funny. I'm going to talk about it here real quick. Is Ayanamsha. You're going to want to know what an Ayanamsha is. So that's the first dimension, is learning that. And so when I look at it, there's like a good way to use the first dimension information, and there's kind of a lesser way. Like, for example, Ayanamsha is a perfect example. Whereas, like, if you sit there and you talk about Ayanamsha and you look and you're like, okay, well, there's Lahiri Ayanamsha, there's this and that, there's so many different Ayanamshas. So if you sit there and just become versed in which Ayanamsha means what, and which one to choose, it's like, it really becomes a pointless discussion when we're talking about Ayanamsha. When you start looking at this and this, I say just choose the one that resonates best with you. Because if you sit there and learn that and that and that, what's not happening is you're not actually studying astrology. You're wasting time. Honestly, I don't want to say it's meaningless, but I think it's a debate that's not really using the best of our knowledge to go about. So where I think it's more important to know a good usage, I would say, of the information is learning about the planets, the houses, the signs, the nakshatras, learning about those things. Because if you know all the qualities and characteristics that make up those things, then you're going to know, you're not really going to have, you're going to be a good astrologer. That's all there is to it. That is all there is to it. If you know the first dimension of the first dimension, and you know all the difference between all the indications of what each Rashi means. If you know that, and you're like, oh wow, so this is Cancer, and this rules this, and this, and this. This is Libra. This has this energy, and this, and like you're able to tie that all together. And you're able to talk about it. If anybody asks you, oh yeah, Sun in Aries, oh yeah, I'm going to tell you it's going to be a real person that's really bright and initiating and ready to just go forward with their energy, their will, and their courage is just going to be boom. And you're going to know that because you know about what the Sun is bringing, what Aries is bringing. So that's, getting into the second dimension thing, but that's the importance of the first dimension. If you know the first dimension, you can do everything. You can do second dimension, you can do third dimension. You can judge things, you can understand things, because once you understand these energies of all these different things, all these different planets, signs, houses, nakshatras, then when you see it get all tied together, and you see that product, you're not like, oh well, gee, how is that gonna? I wonder how that's gonna play out. You don't have to wonder how that's gonna play out. You're just gonna know. And what you'll do is you'll talk to clients. You'll talk to clients and be like, yeah, oh, wow, and you'll know the energies that are tying together. And why I said that the first dimension never ends, because the way that it works, like you're gonna talk to clients and you're gonna find out something new. You'd be like, oh my gosh, I can totally see why during Mars Dasha this person became a firefighter or something. Oh yeah, duh. All these things lining up. This makes so much sense. And you'll know that because you know about the first dimension of the planets. It's not like, why would he be a firefighter during the Mars Dasha? I mean, if you know enough about Mars, you're like, yeah, of course that's the case. And with that being said, so then when we talk about the individual things, so you want to know about, so I want to kind of tie back into the planets, and we're talking about the first dimension now, so let's get a little bit more concrete here when we're talking about the first dimension or the first dimension. So we're talking about the planet. You're going to want to know what its characteristics and traits and qualities are, so that way you can know what, and then you want to learn what all the things that it rules through all its karkaships, and then you also want to know which Rashis or Rashi, those planets rule, because that starts to make a little bit of sense. And then when you know about the planets in an individual sense like that, you're also going to want to pay attention to the order of the planets, because that kind of teaches you something. There's two orders of the planets, one that has to do with the nakshatras, and one that has to do with like the days of the week, the ones that we're familiar with now. And then you also want to know about like the groups of planets and how those work together. What's the groups of planets? Oh, well, like Sun and Saturn is a father-son combination. Moon and Mercury is a father-son combination. And then and you learn how like Saturn and Mars kind of share some similar qualities and will help each other out. If Mars is weak, then Saturn can help. So I mean, once you learn about the planets and what they're representing and stuff, you get a real idea. So you know that. So when you're looking at charts, you're not like, well, gee, this person, oh, they've got this bad, but then you'll see, oh, well, this is good, so this is going to help them balance out that. Like, you'll know that when you know about the qualities and how all these things tie together. So yeah, so you also want to know the houses. You want to know everything about the houses that you possibly can. You want to know everything about the nakshatras. This one is so deep. Of all the parts of astrology, it's the planets and the nakshatras, I think, that have the most characteristics about them. I mean, the nakshatras, the amount of characteristics and traits and qualities, it takes a long time, because, and then the other key about this information, the way it gets integrated into your mind is through memorization. When I first started studying astrology, I had a book. I had Light on Life by Robert Svoboda and Hart Defoe. And I took this book, and I was like, I would read it, I'd read about the planets. I'd read about the signs. I'd read about the houses. And then by the time I got to the third thing, the houses, it's like I already started forgetting what it said about the planets and what it said about the the house, or I'm sorry, the signs. And so what I did is I sat there and I took a notebook and I literally basically rewrote that book. Because I sat there and I said, okay, this is what the planets represent. This is all their qualities that are here. So I took, you know, so here it was in that book. It listed like a group of qualities that was assigned to each planet. Then it listed another group of qualities assigned to each planet. So then I sat there, and what I did is I did the opposite of that, which I took each planet and wrote on one page what it was in all the different categories for each planet. I did that. It was I can't even tell you how helpful of an exercise that was, because that's what it took for me. I'm not a great memorizer. I have to read things over 2 and 3 and 4 times, and sometimes I have to read it, write it down, read my writing of it, and watch a video on it, and then take a quiz and a test on it. I have to test myself sometimes to get myself to memorize it, but I know that enough about myself because that's how I did it. But now I have a pretty darn good grasp on what the planets and signs and houses are all about. And so that's very important. So that's the first of the first dimension right there. That's the first dimension of the first dimension. So now let's talk about the first dimension of the second dimension. So information integration. So the first dimension of the second dimension, we talking about the second dimension is how things tie together. So what's the first dimension of that? Is knowing how those things are going to tie together. So what we're talking about here is looking at a chart, knowing what the ascendant is, and not just knowing what the ascendant is, but what that means by, okay, so if this is the ascendant in Leo, then I'm going to know that Virgo is the second house. I'm going to know that Capricorn is the sixth house, etc., 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 through all that. But just knowing that, not having to think that. Not having to think that, being able to see it and be like, okay, I know that this planet is good for a Virgo ascendant. You know, I know that this planet is bad for a Virgo ascendant. I know that this is the planet I really want to be well placed for a Virgo ascendant. And if this planet over here is not doing too well, it's just automatically knowing that. You're like, Virgo ascendant, and boom. And what do you know about Virgo ascendant? You know about the first dimension stuff. You know what the Rashi Virgo is all about. So you're like, okay, this person's going to have these kind of qualities in their life. And I'm also going to know, because of the first dimension, I'm going to know that Mercury rules Virgo. And so I know that I'm going to need to really look at Mercury and see what Mercury is doing for that Virgo ascendant. That's going to be a very important thing. And so now that's also now getting into, when I started talking about Mercury and where it's at for that Virgo ascendant, now we're really starting to talk about the second dimension. Now we're really starting to see, well, okay, where is that tying in? How is Mercury, the ascendant lord, tying into that chart? And it's tying into that chart by the sign that it's placed in. So what sign is it placed in? Okay. Then how does it tie into the qualities of that sign? Okay. And then how is Mercury as a planet tying into that sign? How is Mercury now Mercury just as the first house lord, how is that tying into that sign? And then what house is in that sign? What house does that represent? So how is Mercury as a planet in that house? How is Mercury as a house lord in that house? How is the first lord in that house? What does that look like? And then you can also then start looking at, if there's another planet in there, Mercury's with Venus in that house. So what does that mean to have Mercury and Venus there together? What does it mean to have the first lord with Venus? What does it mean to have, and then Venus is the second lord. What does it mean to have the first and the second lord there? What does it mean to have the first and the second lord in that Rashi? What does it mean to have the first and the second? See, it goes on and on and on, and being able to realize, because that's what's going to tell you the picture, because the second dimension is all about just how the areas of life come together. It's not to measure. It's not to measure depth. It's not to measure how good or bad something is. The second dimension is just, how is this energy interweaving? And I mentioned this in the very first video, the overview of the 4 dimensions. I mentioned this, is that the second dimension is very well overlooked, because a lot of times we go directly, we see the second dimension, we see these 2 planets together, and we start already attaching meaning and depth and talking about whether that's a good or a bad thing, when it's like, hold on, that energy's there. Let's talk about what it means. Let's think about first, before we start looking about if that's a good thing or a bad thing. Let's just get an idea of how that could work out. Oh yeah, okay, so you have Moon and Saturn together, right? You're like, oh boy, that's the one where I don't care if I see a Moon Saturn, I'm gonna cringe. I'm like, oh my gosh, because I know what that can represent. So when I wince and I cringe, that's because I know That's because my mind's already going to the third dimension. My mind's going to the third dimension without even analyzing the first and the second dimension, because there might actually be something decent about that. Maybe those are two angular houses that are together that are going to create some really nice yogas. And so if you weren't paying attention to that, you just go Moon Saturn, oh yeah, and you just cringe, then you're like, yeah. But there might actually be something good happening there. So be aware of that. And so that's why it's important to look at all the different things for the two-dimensional, so that you can get your flat two-dimensional picture and understand. And that'll really, you can talk to people just with the second dimension. You don't need to talk about the third dimension, because they can tell you, you can start just with the second dimension alone. You can learn about maybe possibly even their careers. You can learn about what their family members are like, what their wife is like, their dad, their mom, and all this stuff, because you're looking at these things from the fourth house. You're like, oh, let me talk about your mother, or let me find the fourth house gust. And I'm going to look at from there, and I'm going to talk about how it's in your life. It's really funny. Sometimes you can really come up with some really good information for people, and they'll ask you, they're like, yeah, well, what do you think about my child, it's got this problems, and you look at it, you go to the fifth cusp, you find that the house that the fifth cusp is in, and you look at everything from that fifth cusp. Very, very interesting and fascinating. I love astrology because of this. Now, okay, so that's the first dimension of the second dimension, is just being able to know where the things are, knowing what to look for, knowing how these things can possibly tie together. And then let's go ahead and talk about the first dimension of the third dimension. So the first dimension of the third dimension is, so the third dimension is applying depth. This is really where we start talking about techniques, because then we're going to get into things like Shadbala. And a lot of times, Shadbala is, I think, a perfect example of this. Most of the time we look at the little graph of Shadbala where it shows each planet and it gives you a number. It'll say like Sun is at 390 points, which puts it at exactly 100%. And so you'll just look at that and you'll just ignore it and you'll go away. Like, okay, that's great. What does Shadbala mean? Oh, it means strength. It's capable. Well, if you know about Shadbala, if you know the first dimension completely of this third dimension technique, Shadbala is going to give you depth, an idea of how strong or weak or troubled a planet is. Just by Shadbala, then you have to realize that Shadbala itself is translated to mean 6 strengths. So you actually have to know what those, if you know what those 6 strengths are, you'll know a lot more about how that planet is performing, what areas of life that it's really excelling at, what areas of life that it is really struggling with, how well they're going to be able to use that planet and in what situations. And then you'll get the overall, then you'll really understand that overall score of why that planet is robust or not. So you learn everything about Shadbala. Same thing, like when we start talking about planetary dignities, it's very important to understand the natural relationships of the planets and learning just what makes up dignity, how dignity is constituted. And same thing when we start talking about Avashtas. Avashta is another way to judge how a planet is doing, to judge how its state is, which that's what it is. It's the state. It's the state. It creates like a feeling or an experience. And so once you know that, that's a very big piece of information right there. But you need to learn how these things are formed. Like, what's the combination? What is all the different ways that an Avashta can happen? So when you learn that, see, you have to. So there's a lot of times where we look at things and we kind of get ahead of ourselves. And so that's why it's so important to make sure that you're learning how to use your technique. For example, I'll tell you something that I struggle with. Something that I struggle with is being able to understand how to use Gemini for determining career. This is a course by Ernst Wilhelm that he has, and I've spent some time studying charts, and it just hasn't come to me yet. And so what do? I literally sat there and I said, where am I struggling with this? Am I struggling with this in the first dimension, the second dimension, or the third dimension? Am I not seeing these things come together? Where I struggle with it is in the second dimension. And I've realized that. And there's times where I've struggled, because I told you earlier that I'm not the greatest at memorization. Well, so what do I have to do? That's why I take a lot of notes. When I study astrology, I take a lot of notes. When I'm even doing charts for clients, I take notes on the chart. I take notes on the chart because it helps me so much. It helps me see more things, actually. I even have templates for for chart analysis. I don't necessarily stick to it, but it's such a great process to know that, like, okay, look for this technique, use this technique, what does it say here, what does it say here? Okay, that's getting a little tangential, so I'm going to step back from that real quick. That's just a fun discussion, something for you to think about, something that can actually help you as an astrologer. So anyway, so the first dimension of the third dimension is no matter which technique that you're using, no matter how you're judging the depth of how well that is doing, if you're talking about, oh, it's exalted, oh, so it's just a wonderful, robust planet, well, what does exaltation mean? How is exaltation determined? And yeah, so I mean, knowing what that strength is, and if you know about exaltation, what you'll see about exaltation is that that's an avashta. You'll know that that's a dignity, a planetary dignity. You'll also know that that's its own strength, which is actually a formative piece of Shadbala, and it's actually a smaller formative piece of Shadbala, believe it or not. So I mean, it's things like that. See, because I knew that with exaltation, I know that there's like 2 or 3 different things. I know it's important, but I also know that in some ways, when we're looking at Shadbala, exaltation is just one small piece of the puzzle. It's like 1/16th, 1/17th, 1/18th, whatever the number is of the different techniques that are, or the different strengths that go into Shadbala. So that's the first dimension, the second dimension, the third dimension, or the first dimension of the first dimension of the second dimension, first dimension of the third dimension. Now, there's also the fourth dimension, which is timing, which I think is pretty much easy to see after we've gone through this discussion. So the first dimension of the fourth dimension is knowing the different types of timing, and knowing what they are. Like, so when we talk about planetary dashas, knowing how that dasha is calculated and brought about. So we know with Vimshotri dasha, it's the placement of the moon in the nakshatra that it's in, and then the lord of that nakshatra, where the moon is placed, is the first one. Then how far along through that nakshatra is how far along through that dasha is, and then knowing the lengths of each dasha and the order of each dasha, and seeing how that all comes together. So I mean, that's the first dimension, is not just necessarily knowing, like, this guy's in Mars dasha. Right. Okay, that's great, but what is the dasha? How long is the dasha? And if you know about Mars dasha, you know that I know that it's 7 years, and I also know that it's followed by Rahu, and it's preceded by preceded by Moon dasha. And so when you know these things, and you know the order of the dashas and the way that they go, and you know it's going to go Mars, Rahu, Mars, Saturn, Mars, Jupiter, Mars. Anyway, you know the orders of the dashas and the sub-dashas and the anterdashas and everything. That's very important. And then, so that's one type. And then you want to know about transits. You want to know what a transit is. You want to know how to use transits, what's important to look at. You want to know that a transit is over the natal position of a planet. It's where the transit is where the current planet orbiting wherever it is in the sky now versus the house that it's in right now, or the nakshatra that it's in, and then correlating that to what is in that house or nakshatra in the natal chart, and also what it's aspecting by transiting. And there's a lot to it. I mean, it can just be about that. You can just talk about Saturn and his long transit of 2.5 years to whatever sign he's at currently in the sky right now versus what that sign in the birth chart is, and what planets are there, and what it's crossing over. So, I mean, there's a lot of different ways. There's a whole trigger transit technique that I've learned through Ernst Wilhelm, which is absolutely fascinating, and I've found it to be completely valid and accurate. I'm not going to go into it here, but I know that to be able to use it, what do you have to do? You have to know the first dimension. You have to know what it's all about before you start putting these things into play. If you're just looking at it like, okay, Jupiter's transiting this, but you don't know what a transit is, how to look for what that's going to bring about, what Ashtaka Varga is, and if you don't know how those things are, what they mean, then don't play with Ashtaka Varga if you don't know what it is. If you don't know what it is and how it's used and how it can be applied into a chart, I'd say ignore it. If you don't know what transit is, you don't feel comfortable talking about it, ignore it. So learn about all these different things. Learn about Varsha Fall and all the specific different rules that it takes to do a Varsha Fall chart. Varsha Fall is wonderful. The breadth of information that you can get just by looking at the yearly chart for a person is absolutely fascinating. And so now I'll talk about this also. When it comes to the first dimension of the fourth dimension, what I will tell you, the information that one giant piece of information that I will give you if you want to predict anything for people and you want to get your predictions accurate, if you see it in Vimshottari Dasha, see if you can find it in the sky. You see if you find it in the sky, see if you can find it in Varshafal. See if you can find it, and there's Rashi Dashas as well. There's Jaimini's Rashi Dashas, and there's 12. I think there's more actually. I know there's at least 12, and knowing how to look at those, how those are involved with transits, how those are involved with the different Vargas, and so there's just a lot to it. Learn your first dimension, learn your information, learn how to integrate it. Start with the first dimension of the first dimension. If you're struggling with the technique, which is a third dimensional thing, because the technique is always going to give you a result, break it down. Be like, where am I struggling with this technique? If this technique isn't working, either it can be a bad technique, because there's a lot of people who have techniques because they've found something that worked for them in 3 charts, or 5 charts, or maybe even 10 charts, but not in 1,000 charts. They didn't take the big breadth of knowledge and really use it. And sometimes some people are just intuitive and they're able to bend rules to make things happen. They're like, oh yeah, well this happens here, and then I always know that this happens. But it's just an incredible intuitive ability. So you have to be able to kind of manage through that. So when you're using techniques, it's very important to really go in there and make sure you've got that first dimension down. Then you look at the second dimension and see that, okay, am I tying the right things together for this technique? Am I staying within the rules of this technique? Am I finding the things that are required for this technique to be employable? And then the third dimension, and then then the next thing is like, yeah, the third dimension. Like, okay, now that I know that I understand what this technique is, I understand how it works, I understand the pieces that come together to make it happen, and I'm seeing it in a chart, second dimension, then I can start using it in the third dimension. Now I can really start to test my results and see if I'm actually using the first and the second dimension of that technique well. So anyhow, thank you very much for watching this video, and I hope that this gives you a lot of good information, and namaste.